Hey guys, welcome to your lesson on anxiety and depressive disorders. I want to just say that before we get started, I know I said this at the beginning of this unit, but please do not use these lessons to diagnose yourself or read too far into anything. If you are concerned, you need to please talk to somebody, but please do not use these lessons as a way to diagnose. All right, so we're going to start off with what are anxiety disorders. These are psychological disorders characterized by distressing, persistent anxiety or maladaptive behaviors that reduce anxiety. There's four kinds that we're going to cover in this lesson: social anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, phobia, and agoraphobia. So social anxiety disorder is the intense fear and avoidance of social situations, formerly called social phobia. To stave off anxious thoughts and feelings, including physical symptoms such as sweating and trembling, people with this may avoid going out at all. Generalized anxiety disorder is an anxiety disorder in which a person is continually tense, apprehensive, and in a state of autonomic nervous system arousal. Out of control, agitated feelings suggest generalized anxiety disorder, which is marked by excessive and uncontrollable worry that persists for 6 months or more. People with this condition, 2/3 are women, worry continually, and they're often jittery, agitated, and sleep deprived. Some characteristics of GAD: people usually can't identify and therefore relieve or avoid the tension's cause. And to use Freud's term, the anxiety is free-floating. It's not linked to a specific stressor or threat. GAD is often accompanied by depressive mood, but even without depression, it tends to be disabling. Moreover, it can lead to physical problems such as high blood pressure, sleep disturbances, and other issues. Panic disorder is an anxiety disorder marked by unpredictable, minutes-long episodes of intense dread. Panic attacks, in which a person may experience terror and accompanying chest pain, choking, and other frightening sensations, often followed by worry over a possible next attack. For the 3% of people with panic disorder, panic attacks are recurrent. These anxiety tornadoes strike suddenly, wreak havoc, and disappear, but are not forgotten. What does a panic attack feel like? Golfer Charlie Belgian experienced what he later learned were panic attacks during an important tournament. His thumping heartbeat and shortness of breath led him to think he was having a heart attack. Hospital tests revealed that his symptoms were not related to a physical illness. He recovered, went on to win $846,000, and has become an inspiration to others. How can panic attacks lead to agoraphobia? After several panic attacks, people may avoid situations where panic might strike. If their fear is intense enough, people may develop agoraphobia, fear or avoidance of public situations from which escape might be difficult. Given such fear, people may avoid being outside the home, in a crowd, or in an elevator. What is a phobia? An anxiety disorder marked by a persistent irrational fear and avoidance of a specific object, activity, or situation. What are specific phobias? Specific phobias may focus on animals, insects, heights, blood, or close spaces. Now notice that the blue is fear and the green are phobias. So there is a much higher level of fear of heights compared to actual phobia of heights, and all the rest. What is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder? This is a disorder characterized by unwanted repetitive thoughts, obsessions, actions, compulsions, or both. What are some common obsessions and compulsions among those with OCD? Rituals and fussy behaviors cross the fine line between normality and disorder when they persistently interfere with everyday living and cause distress. So some obsessions: concerned with dirt, germs, or toxins, obsessing with something terrible happening, fire, death, or illness, symmetry, order, or exactness, excuse me. Compulsions, which are repetitive behaviors: excessive hand washing, bathing, toothbrushing, or grooming, in and out of a door, up and down from a chair, checking doors, locks, appliances, car brakes, homework. Now, what's the difference between a normal behavior and one suggesting OCD? So normal is that you check that you lock the door. That's normal. Washing your hands thoroughly is normal. Organizing your markers and pens in rainbow order is normal. Checking 10 times that you lock the door is not. Washing your hands so often that your skin becomes raw is not. Not being able to use a pen unless it's in a rainbow order is not. So thriving with OCD. Music star Justin Timberlake has openly discussed his OCD disorder. He says that support from family and a rich sense of humor have helped him cope with the challenges. What other disorders are classified as OCD-related disorders in the DSM-5? Hoarding disorder, cluttering one's space with acquired possessions one can't let go. Body dysmorphic disorder, preoccupation with perceived body defects. Trichotillomania, hair pulling. Excoriation disorder, excessive skin picking. What is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? This is characterized by haunting memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, social withdrawal, jumpy anxiety, numbness of feeling, and/or insomnia that lingers for 4 weeks or more after a traumatic experience. Typical symptoms include recurring haunting memories and nightmares, laser-focused attention to possible threats, social withdrawal, jumpy anxiety, and trouble sleeping. Many military war veterans participate in intensive recovery program using deep breathing, massage, and group and individual discussion techniques to treat their PTSD. Why do some develop PTSD after a traumatic event? About half of us will experience at least one traumatic event in our lifetime, yet 5 to 10% of people will develop PTSD after a traumatic event and others don't. One factor that might explain why some develop PTSD and others do not might be the amount of trauma-related emotional distress. The higher the distress, such as the level of physical torture suffered by prisoners of war, the greater the risk for PTSD, post-traumatic symptoms. Some people may have a more sensitive emotional processing limbic system that floods their bodies with stress hormones, which explains why PTSD may coexist with another disorder. Twins, compared with non-twin siblings, more commonly share PTSD cognitive risk factors, and the odds of experiencing PTSD after a traumatic event are about 2 times higher for women than men. Anxious or traumatized people learn to associate their anxiety with certain cues. 58% of those social anxiety disorder developed the disorder following a traumatic event. Anxiety or an anxiety-related disorder is more likely to develop when bad events happen unpredictably and uncontrollably. What is stimulus generalization? Remembering from Module 26 or Unit 4 that in classical conditioning, stimulus generalization is the tendency, once a response has been conditioned, for stimuli similar to the conditioned response to elicit similar responses. In operant conditioning, stimulus generalization occurs when responses learned in one situation occur in other similar situations. How does stimulus generalization explain anxiety, OCD, and PTSD? Stimulus generalization occurs when a person experiences a fearful event and later develops a fear of similar events. If a child's bit by a dog, the fear associated with that bite may develop into a fear of all dogs. What is reinforcement and how does it help explain anxiety, OCD, and PTSD? So remember from Unit 4 in operant conditioning, reinforcement is any event that strengthens the behavior it follows. Reinforcement helps maintain learned fears and anxieties. Anything that enables us to avoid or escape a feared situation can reinforce maladaptive behaviors. Fearing a panic attack, we may decide not to leave the house. Reinforced by feeling calmer, we are likely to repeat that behavior in the future. If washing our hands relieves our feelings of anxiety, we may wash our hands again when those feelings return. How does cognition impact anxiety? Cognition, our thoughts, memories, interpretations, and expectations influences our feelings of anxiety. Our past experiences shape our expectations and influence our interpretations and reactions. Whether we interpret the creaky sound simply as the wind or as a possible knife-wielding attacker determines whether we panic. What research has been conducted on cognition and anxiety? Susan Maneka experimented with 6 monkeys raised in the wild, all strongly fearful of snakes, and their lab-raised offspring, virtually none of feared snakes. After repeatedly observing their parents or peers refusing to reach for food In the presence of a snake, the younger monkeys developed a similar strong fear of snakes. When the monkeys were retested 3 months later, their learned fear persisted. How do genes impact anxiety, OCD, and PTSD? One research team identified 17 gene variations associated with typical anxiety disorder symptoms. Other teams have found genes associated specifically with OCD. If one identical twin has an anxiety disorder, the other is also at risk. Even when raised separately, identical twins may develop similar phobias. How do genes regulate neurotransmitters that impact anxiety, OCD, and PTSD? Some genes influence disorders by regulating brain levels of neurotransmitters. These include serotonin, which influences sleep, mood, and attending to threats. Genes also regulate the levels of glutamate, which heightens activity in the brain's alarm centers. How do our experiences change our brain? Our experiences change our brain, paving new pathways. Traumatic fear learning experiences can leave tracks in the brain, creating fear circuits within the amygdala. These fear pathways create easy inroads for more fear experiences. How are brain structures involved? Well, brain scans of people with OCD reveal elevated activity in the anterior cingulate cortex during behaviors such as compulsive hand washing, checking, ordering, or hoarding. The anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region that monitors our actions and checks for errors, seems especially likely to be hyperactive. The biological perspective helps us understand why most people have more fear of heights than does Alex Honnold, shown at Wright in 2017, becoming the first person to free solo climb with no safety ropes Yosemite National Park's El Capitan granite wall. How does natural selection underlie our fears? We seem biologically prepared to fear threats faced by our ancestors. Our phobias focus on specific fears such as spiders, snakes, and other animals, enclosed spaces, and heights, storms, and darkness. Those fearless about these occasional threats were less likely to survive and leave descendants. Even in Britain, with only one poisonous snake species, people often fear snakes. Moving on to the second part of our lesson, how prevalent is depression? In the past year, have you at some point felt so depressed that it was difficult to function? If so, you weren't alone. In one national survey, 31% of American college students answered yes. In a survey of American high school students, 29% felt so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row that they stopped doing some usual activities. What is major depressive disorder? This is a state of hopelessness and lethargy lasting several weeks or months. How is major depressive disorder diagnosed? At least 5 signs of depression, including either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure, last 2 or more weeks. The DSM-5 classifies major depressive disorder as the presence of at least 5 of the following symptoms over a 2-week period of time, minimally including depressed mood or reduced interest. What is persistent depressive disorder? Persistent depressive disorder, also called dysthymia, is similar to major depressive disorder, but with milder depressive symptoms that last a much longer period of time. How is persistent depressive disorder diagnosed? Adults diagnosed with persistent depressive disorder have experienced a mildly depressive mood more often than not for 2 years or more. They also display at least 2 of the following symptoms: difficulty with decision-making and concentration, feeling hopeless, poor self-esteem, reduced energy levels, problems regulating sleep, problems regulating appetite. Have you cried today? Percentage of men who cried in August and percentage of women who cried, 4% to 7%. December, 8% to 21%. Americans have reported doing so more often in the winter. For some people, depressive symptoms may have a seasonal pattern, returning each winter. What is bipolar disorder? This is a disorder in which a person alternates between the hopelessness and lethargy of depression and the overexcited state of mania, formerly called manic depressive disorder. When a depressive episode ends, A euphoric, overly talkative, wildly energetic, and extremely optimistic state called mania follows. But before long, the mood either returns to normal or plunges again into depression. What does it feel like to suffer from bipolar disorder? So, in her art, Life as a Two-Headed Beast, bipolar artist Abigail Southworth illustrated her personal experience of bipolar disorder. What does research show about the manic phase of bipolar disorder? During the manic phase, people with bipolar disorder typically have little need for sleep. They show fewer sexual inhibitions and their positive emotions persist abnormally. Their speech is loud, flighty, and hard to interrupt. They find advice irritating. They need protection from their own poor judgment, which may lead to reckless spending or unsafe sex. Thinking fast feels good, but it also increases risk-taking. What's the relationship between bipolar disorder and creativity? In milder forms, mania's energy and flood of ideas can fuel creativity. Clusters of genes associated with high creativity increase the likelihood of having bipolar disorder, and risk factors for developing bipolar disorder predict greater creativity. What does research show about the implications of bipolar disorder? Though bipolar disorder is much less common than major depressive disorder, it's more dysfunctional, claiming twice as many lost workdays early. Bipolar disorder is a potent predictor of suicide. Americans are twice as likely as people of other countries to have ever had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. What are biological explanations for major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder? Genetic predispositions, neurochemical imbalances, nutritional deficits. What is the genetic factor? The risk of being diagnosed with major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder increases if your parent or sibling has the disorder. If one identical twin is diagnosed with major depressive disorder, the chances are about 1 in 2 that at some time the other twin will be too. If one identical twin has bipolar disorder, the chances of a similar diagnosis for the co-twin are even higher, 7 in 10, even for twins raised apart. What is the heritability of certain disorders? So, using aggregated data from studies of identical and fraternal twins, researchers estimated the heritability of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anorexia nervosa, major depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. So, heritability estimates percent of variation due to genetic influence. If you look on the left, bipolar disorder is the highest and generalized anxiety disorder is the lowest. What brain structures play a role in depression and bipolar disorder? In people with bipolar disorder, studies discovered a decrease in myelinated axons and enlarged fluid-filled ventricles. Depression can cause the brain's reward centers to become less active. During positive emotions, the left frontal lobe and an adjacent reward center become more active. These top-facing PET scans show that the brain energy consumption rises and falls with the patient's emotional switches. Red areas are where the brain rapidly consumes glucose. So you can see that depressed state and a manic state, the brain scans are totally different colors. How do neurotransmitter systems influence depressive disorders and bipolar disorder? Norepinephrine, which increases arousal and boosts mood, is scarce during depression and overabundant during mania. Serotonin is scarce or inactive during depression. One study showed that depression is related to the combination of two factors, significant life stress plus a variation of a serotonin controlling gene. How do physical exercise reduce depression? How does it reduce depression? Repetitive physical exercise such as jogging reduces depression in part because it increases serotonin, which affects mood and arousal. In one study, running for 2 hours increased brain activation and regions associated with euphoria. How can diet reduce depression? People who eat a heart-healthy Mediterranean diet heavy on fish, vegetables, olive oil have a comparatively low risk of developing heart disease, stroke, late-life cognitive decline, and depression, all of which are associated with inflammation. How can alcohol use and abuse lead to depression? Excessive alcohol use also correlates with depression, partly because depression can increase alcohol use, but mostly because alcohol misuse leads to depression. How do life experiences play a role in depression and bipolar disorder? Diet, drugs, stress, and other environmental influences lay down epigenetic marks, molecular genetic tags that can turn certain genes on or off. Animal studies suggest that long-lasting epigenetic influences may play a role in depression. How does the social cognitive perspective explain depression and bipolar disorder? The social cognitive perspective explores how people's assumptions and expectations influence what they perceive. Many depressed people view life through the dark glasses of low self-esteem. Their intensely negative assumptions about themselves, their situation, and their future lead them to magnify bad experiences and minimize good ones. How do our thoughts lead to depression? Expecting the worst, depressed people's self-defeating beliefs and their negative explanatory style feed their depression. Overthinking or rumination may also impact depression. What's rumination? Compulsive fretting, overthinking our problems and their causes. Psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema related women's higher risk of depression to what she described as their tendency to ruminate or overthink. Relentless, self-focused rumination can distract us, increase negative emotion, and disrupt daily activities. How do social media comparisons factor into depression? When people scroll through social media feeds and see Maria having a blast with friends, Angelique enjoying a family vacation, and Tyra looking super cute in a swimsuit, the response may be, "My life is terrible." What is explanatory style? Well, explanatory style, who or what we blame for our failures, seems to be similar for those suffering from depression. What explanatory style seems common in those diagnosed with depression? Individuals diagnosed with depression often explain bad events in terms that are stable, meaning it's going to last forever, global, it'll affect everything I do, or internal, it's all my fault. How does research show, or what does research show about explanatory style of people diagnosed with depression? Depression-prone people respond to bad events in especially self-focused, self-blaming way. When people diagnosed with depression describe themselves, their brains show extra activity in a region that processes self-relevant information. Individuals prone to depression have self-esteem that is more plastic. It climbs with praise and plummets with threats. What is learned helplessness? So the hopelessness and passive resignation an animal or person acquires when unable to avoid repeated aversive events. So uncontrollable bad event, perceived lack of control, generalized helpless behavior. How might learned helplessness lead to depression? Self-defeating beliefs may arise from learned helplessness. Pessimistic, overgeneralized, self-blaming attributions may create a depressing sense of hopelessness. Why is depression more common among Western cultures? Psychologist Martin Seligman pointed to the rise of individualism and the decline of commitment to religion and family in Western individualistic cultures. In non-Western collectivist cultures where close-knit relationships and cooperation are the norm, major depressive disorder is less common and less tied to self-blame over personal failure. How is depression a vicious cycle? Depression is both a cause and an effect of stressful experiences that disrupt our sense of who we are and why we are worthy human beings. What are the pieces of the depression puzzle? 1. Stressful experiences interpreted through a ruminating, pessimistic, explanatory style create a hopeless, depressed state that hampers the way the person thinks and acts. This, in turn, fuels further stressful experiences, such as rejection. What does the research show regarding suicide? Each year, over 800,000 despairing people worldwide will elect a permanent solution to what might have been a temporary problem. For those who have been anxious, the risk of suicide is tripled, and for those who have been depressed, the risk is quintupled. People seldom commit suicide while in the depths of depression, when energy and initiative are lacking. The risk increases when they begin to rebound and become capable of following through. How do gender and age impact suicide? Women are more likely than men to attempt suicide, but men are 2 to 4 times more likely to actually end their lives. In late adulthood, suicide rates increase, with the highest rate among 45 to 64-year-olds, and the second highest among those 85 and older. Men exposed to a family suicide were 8 times more likely to commit suicide than were non-exposed men. Gay, transgender, and gender non-conforming youth facing an unsupportive environment, including family or peer rejection, are also at increased risk of attempting suicide. Following highly publicized suicides and TV programs featuring suicide, known suicides increase. What factors may trigger suicidal urges? Suicidal urges typically arise when people feel disconnected from others and a burden to them, or when they feel defeated and trapped by an inescapable situation. People, especially older adults, may choose death as an alternative to current or future suffering. a way to switch off unendurable pain and relieve a perceived burden on family members. How can we help someone considering suicide? Listen, empathize, and offer friendship. Connect. Involve the school psychologist or counselor, refer the person to the suicide prevention lifeline or crisis text line, and protect. Seek help from a trusted adult, a parent, a teacher, a school nurse, or a school counselor, or call 911. What is non-suicidal self-injury, NSSI? Some people may engage in NSSI. Such behavior, though painful, is not fatal. Those who engage in NSSI may cut or burn their skin, hit themselves, insert objects under their nails or skin, or self-administer tattoos. Does NSSI lead to suicide? Usually not. Who is most at risk for non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI? Self-injury rates peak higher for females than for males, and between the ages of 15 and 19.